Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about one of the fastest and most dramatic national transformations in modern history. It is the story of Japan's Meiji Restoration and how an island nation reinvented itself before the outside world could decide its future. Imagine Japan in the middle of the 19th century. For more than 200 years, the country had been ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate. Japan was peaceful, highly organized, and connected by busy roads, growing cities, and strong local markets. But politically, it still followed an old feudal system. The emperor lived in Kyoto and held great symbolic importance, but real political power belonged to the shogun in Edo, the city we now call Tokyo. Across the country, regional lords called daimyo controlled their own territories, collected taxes, and commanded samurai warriors. For a long time, this system worked surprisingly well. Japan avoided the large wars that had damaged it in earlier centuries, and ordinary life became more stable. But here's the thing. While Japan was enjoying internal peace, the world outside was changing at incredible speed. European countries were building factories, steamships, railways, and modern armies. Their industrial power gave them weapons and resources that older political systems could not easily resist. Across Asia, Western empires were taking ports, forcing trade agreements, and controlling weaker countries. China's defeat in the Opium Wars was especially frightening for Japanese leaders. China had long been seen as the great center of East Asian civilization, yet British forces defeated it and forced it to accept humiliating treaties. Japanese officials watched this closely, and they understood the warning. A country did not need to be fully conquered to lose its freedom. Foreign powers could control its ports, its trade, its taxes, and even parts of its legal system. Then, in 1853, the warning arrived directly at Japan's shores. American Commodore Perry entered Japanese waters with a fleet of steam-powered warships. The Japanese call them the Black Ships, partly because of their dark hulls and the thick smoke rising from their engines. But the ships were more than impressive machines. They were a message. Perry was demanding that Japan open its ports to American vessels, and everyone understood that military force stood behind that demand. Think about the choice facing the shogunate. If it refused, Japan might face a war it was not ready to win. If it accepted, the government would look weak and unable to defend the country. The shogunate eventually agreed to open several ports, and more treaties followed with other Western powers. These agreements limited Japan's control over trade and gave special legal rights to foreigners. To many Japanese people, they were deeply humiliating. And this is where a foreign crisis became a political revolution. Critics began asking a dangerous question. If the shogunate could not protect Japan, then why should it continue to rule? A movement grew around the slogan, "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians." At first, many activists truly wanted to push foreigners out of Japan. But when they confronted Western military power directly, they discovered something uncomfortable. Japan could not defeat the West by simply rejecting it. It had to learn from it. That contradiction shaped the entire Meiji transformation. The same people who once shouted against foreign influence would soon import foreign weapons, hire foreign experts, and study Western institutions. They were not doing this because they wanted Japan to become Western. They were doing it because they wanted Japan to remain independent. Powerful regional domains um, especially Satsuma and Choshu, began building modern armies and challenging the shogunate. Their leaders formed an alliance, and in 1868, they declared that political authority had been restored to the young Emperor Meiji. This event became known as the Meiji Restoration. But honestly, the word restoration can be misleading. Japan was not simply returning to an older imperial system. It was creating something completely new. The emperor became the symbol of national unity, while a small group of officials and former samurai began redesigning the government. They used ancient imperial authority to justify modern revolutionary change. There was resistance, of course. Supporters of the old shogunate fought against the new government in the Boshin War. The conflict was not as destructive as many other civil wars, but its outcome was extremely important. The new imperial government won, and Japan now had a single political center strong enough to begin national reform. The first major challenge was the old domain system. Japan was still divided into territories ruled by former daimyo, each with its own officials, tax system, and military traditions. A modern national government could not function effectively while these regional powers remained independent. So the Meiji leaders persuaded the daimyo to return their lands to the emperor. Soon afterward, the domains were abolished and replaced with prefectures controlled by the central government. This was a huge political change. For centuries, people had lived under local rulers and local laws. Now, taxes, military service, education, and administration would be organized nationally. The government handled the former lords carefully. Instead of simply destroying them, it compensated them and gave many of them places within a new aristocratic system. You know, this was one reason the revolution succeeded. The leaders were willing to break old institutions, but they also knew when compromise could prevent a larger rebellion. The next target was the samurai class. Under the old system, the samurai held a special position as hereditary warriors. They received payments from their lords, carried swords, and enjoyed social privileges that ordinary farmers and merchants did not have. But a national government needed a national army. So Japan introduced military conscription, requiring men from ordinary families to serve. This meant that a farmer's son could now become a soldier of the emperor. The samurai no longer had a monopoly on military power. Their traditional payments were gradually removed, and many of their privileges disappeared. Some former samurai adapted very well. They became officers, teachers, police officials, government workers, and business leaders. Their education and discipline made them valuable to the new state. Others felt betrayed and left behind. The most famous resistance came in 1877 during the Satsuma Rebellion. Former samurai rose against the government, but the new conscript army defeated them. That defeat sent a clear message. The old warrior order was finished, and military power now belonged to the state. But armies and government offices cost money. So the Meiji leaders reformed taxation. Under the old system, taxes were often collected in rice and could vary from one domain to another. The new government created a national land tax based on the value of the land, with payments made in money. This gave the state a more stable source of income. That money paid for soldiers, schools, roads, railways, factories, and government departments. But let's be honest, the burden was heavy. Farmers often had to pay fixed taxes even when harvests were poor or crop prices fell. Japan's modernization was not free. Ordinary rural families paid much of the early cost, even when they received few immediate benefits. Education became another central part of the transformation. The government built a national school system because it needed literate workers, engineers, teachers, officers, and officials. A factory could import a machine, but someone had to understand how to operate it, repair it, and improve it. A modern army could buy rifles, but it also needed mathematics, logistics, medicine, communication, and trained leadership. So education was not treated as a luxury. It was national infrastructure. Schools also helped create a shared Japanese identity. Children in different parts of the country studied common subjects, learned a standardized national language, and were taught loyalty to the emperor. Military service had a similar effect. Young men from different regions trained together, followed the same commands, and began to see themselves as members of one nation. Here's the interesting part. The Meiji leaders did not believe they could modernize Japan by guessing. They wanted to study the most powerful countries directly. In the early 1870s, a large group of officials and students traveled through the United States and Europe on what became known as the Iwakura Mission. They visited factories, schools, courts, parliaments, shipyards, banks, and military facilities. And they noticed that there was no single Western model. Britain offered lessons in industry and naval power. France offered ideas about law and administration. Germany and Prussia offered models for military organization and a strong constitutional state. The United States showed the power of mass education, large-scale infrastructure, and rapid economic development. Japan's leaders selected ideas from many countries, then adjusted them to fit Japanese conditions. They were not simply copying, they were building a system from carefully chosen parts. The government also played a direct role in industrialization. It built railways, telegraph lines, mines, shipyards, and model factories. It imported machinery and hired foreign specialists to train Japanese workers. At first, private businesses often lacked the money and technical knowledge required for these large projects. So the state accepted the early risk. Later, many government-owned businesses were sold to private investors. This helped create powerful industrial and financial groups, which later became known as the Zaibatsu. The system was neither completely government-controlled nor completely free market. The government guided development, while private companies gradually took over production and expansion. And wait, this part is really important. The machines were not the greatest achievement. The institutions around the machines were, a railway is not just a train and some tracks. It needs engineers, schedules, laws, financing, maintenance teams, communication systems, and standardized time. A modern navy is not just a collection of ships. It needs shipyards, trained officers, fuel supplies, maps, medical services, and reliable taxation. Japan succeeded because it built entire systems, not because it simply purchased foreign technology. Foreign experts were hired, but they were usually meant to be temporary teachers. Japanese students learned from them, replaced them, and eventually developed their own skills that reduced dependence on outsiders. Political reform came more slowly. Many Japanese people demanded representative government, civil rights, and a national assembly. The Meiji leaders accepted that Japan needed modern laws and political institutions, but they feared losing control too quickly. In 1889, Japan adopted the Meiji Constitution. It created a parliament called the Imperial Diet, but major power remained with the emperor, senior officials, and the military. So Japan became constitutional, but it was not yet fully democratic. Political participation expanded while the ruling elite protected its own authority. By the end of the 19th century, the results of the transformation were becoming clear. Japan had a centralized government, a modern army and navy, growing industries, national schools, railways, and a new legal system. It had moved from vulnerability to strength in only a few decades. But the story has a darker side. Japan had modernized partly because it feared becoming a victim of empire. Yet once it gained military power, it began building an empire of its own. Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War and later shocked the world by defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. These victories proved that Japan had become a major power. They also encouraged expansion into Taiwan, Korea, and other parts of Asia. The nation that had feared foreign domination began dominating its neighbors. And that gives the Meiji Restoration its deepest contradiction. Modernization gave Japan the strength to defend its independence, but it also gave the state the power to control others. So, what can we really learn from this story? Japan did not succeed because it abandoned its culture and became a copy of Europe. It succeeded because it studied the outside world honestly, recognized its own weaknesses, and adapted foreign ideas to local needs. Its leaders connected education, taxation, military reform, industrial policy, and political centralization. They understood that national strength does not come from one reform or one new technology. It comes from institutions working together. At the same time, the transformation demanded sacrifice. Farmers faced heavy taxes, samurai lost their status, workers entered difficult factory conditions, and political opposition was often controlled or suppressed. The Meiji era was not a simple success story. It was a story of survival, ambition, disruption, and growing power. Japan did not choose between tradition and modernity. Instead, it used traditional imperial symbols to support a modern national state. It borrowed from the world, but it did not allow the world to completely define it. And maybe that is the most powerful part of the story. When Japan faced a future that seemed to be controlled by stronger nations, it decided to reinvent itself quickly enough to remain the author of its own destiny. Thanks for listening. And I hope this story gave you a deeper understanding of how nations respond when history suddenly speeds up. Make sure to subscribe for more stories about the turning points that shaped our world, and I'll see you in the next episode.